And welcome back, folks, to another episode of Bruno and the Professor. Welcome back, Professor.
Welcome back yourself, Bruno.
So we are here. I don't know if we should even claim to be trying to record this in video. I think we're getting a little boy who cried wolf here. I think our listeners, wannabe viewers, are just they've been filled with so much false hope that we would actually record this.
But even with our pathetic efforts over the last few weeks, I should note that our Facebook traffic has gone up significantly. So
good. Well,
we're apparently doing something right.
I guess we're doing something. So yeah, keep commenting, keep liking us on Facebook, and talking to us there. We've got a nice conversation going on, and you can also see the abortive, somewhat semi-abortive attempts at video that we've tried over the years. But we're trying again. I mean, hope springs eternal. We'll get there.
I think this is going to be the week.
We'll get there. Yeah,
I think it's going to be the week.
The stars may finally align. So let's see. Last week we broadcast on a Monday night, and it was kind of insane because it was just hours after the marathon attacks in Boston, and kind of we didn't know anything. We didn't know what was going to happen, and just a hell of a week, huh?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, it was all kinds of craziness. I mean, I think there's so many things that history will talk about when they talk about this week. The obvious one, of course, is the actual bombings themselves, and of course the manhunt around the bombings. I think this is going to be a noted week in media history as well. I don't know if you've followed any of the coverage of the coverage that's been going on, but you had things like the New York Post actually leading with a front page photo of two people who were not actually involved in the crime.
Yeah, so they identified the wrong guy. CNN didn't really comport itself all that gracefully. They said that there was a suspect arrest was imminent. There was this talk about the Saudi national or this dark-skinned man that had been brought in for questioning. There's a lot of news outlets did a lot of getting it wrong.
Oh yeah, totally.
A couple like NBC and CBS did pretty well, but it's interesting. Like looking at it on Twitter, it's one of those things. I remember last week we were talking about the way in which the coverage is just goes wall to wall instantly, right? Both in the mainstream media and then in things like social media, and you keep refreshing Twitter and there's no new information. I mean, it was one of those things where, looking at CNN was just basically reading random tweets on the air just because they felt the need to go wall to wall with the coverage, but there just wasn't a lot to say.
Yeah,
we didn't know anything. And so just the difference between the gap between the supply of information and the demand for it was just so vast that it was just creating all of these, a lot of pressure to be first, to say something interesting, to fill airtime. And so you ended up with, not to excuse it, but you ended up with a lot of people saying kind of crazy things.
Well, and it does kind of beg the question. I mean, what's the point of cable news in an era of Twitter? If you want breaking news, I mean, I don't know about you, but I was riveted to Twitter during large parts of the day on Friday, in the middle of the manhunt, and just trying to figure out if there was any actual news coming in. Yeah. And, the types of things that the more traditional, I guess, CNN traditional media are not. 20 years ago, you certainly would have said it was groundbreaking. Nowadays, I think you do have to look at it as a little bit more of a traditional kind of media outlet. And the things that the traditional media outlets are really good at, things like perspective and analysis and contextualization. Right. CNN seems to still think it needs to be out there breaking stories. And it almost feels to me like the news outlets that are going to do a little bit more like what The Economist does, which is actually understand that they're providing that layer of analysis and contextualization. They're not the source of breaking news for most people about most important issues.
That's really interesting.
I think those news outlets are the ones that are going to be the ones that we're going to consider the best in the future.
So 24-hour cable news had a brief heyday in the era of satellites and satellite hookups and things like that. Call it the CNN famous is famous for its coverage of the first Gulf War, right? That there was a short era where we didn't yet have sophisticated internet tools for getting real-time breaking information, but we had technology that was going to allow us to broadcast, basically use hack television into providing that kind of real-time analysis.
Yes.
Right. So you kind of you go from a newspaper era to a TV era, which is largely dominated by like the quote unquote nightly news, which is providing that kind of analysis and perspective that you're talking about. And then in the 90s and basically the 90s and early 2000s, you have you have this aberration basically where cable news shows up and it's the best thing we have for the kind of constant 24-hour, gimme, what's going on right now, and the internet just kind of came in and is basically
blows it up, especially for things like this, where it's like, look, if you've got stories, here's where it goes a little off the rails, right? If you've got a story like the first Gulf War, which I think is where CNN really came into its own,
right?
There is a lot of stuff going on. Even if there's not much to actually report on, there's enough action that's happening all over the place that there's always enough that you can have somebody, maybe they're live at the Pentagon, maybe they're actually live at the scene of an airfield in the Middle East someplace. But you can, through clever editing and production, you can sort of construct a narrative arc through the various disparate threads because there's so much happening. I'd argue that 9/11 was something similar to that as well, where there was so much that was happening from the folks on the ground in New York and outside of DC and at the Pentagon to, in the White House to stories of, other terrorists kind of popping up. That what CNN did a really good job of was kind of stitching all that stuff together into some kind of narrative. Fast forward to what happened last week in Boston, you have a relatively self-contained thing. You have a relatively small group of people that are being sought after in a relatively contained area where there's just not that much happening. Right. The whole point of having an international news organization is kind of obviated by the nature of what this was. And I think in an era where a lot of breaking news kinds of stories tend to be these more personal, these more local kinds of stories. I don't know. I think that the era of cable news has passed us and has been supplanted, as you said, by the era of Twitter and Facebook.
Right, and then you turn to podcasts like Bruno and the Professor
for detailed analysis. This is our niche, Bruno. This is our window.
That's right. We got to exploit it. So
we're going head to head with CNN here because we have bold ambitions on Bruno and the Professor.
Indeed, I didn't intend for us to. I mean, we this is an interesting conversation about the critiques of the media, but talk about the thing itself, right? I mean, so here you went in a week. We went from not knowing what happened to, knowing who to having a couple of suspects, to having an incredible shootout carjacking situation where one of them was killed and others in seriously injured. On my way over here today, NPR was reporting that his tongue and throat were so badly wounded that he may never be able to speak again, even if he does pull through. So just in terms of our ability to question and understand what happened is interesting. So I think take a moment to kind of step back and say, what do we know now about the situation? What does it tell us about, the kind of, so we find out that these two brothers who are Chechen nationals, I guess, although had spent some time in Central Asia as well, and came to the U.S., had struggled to fit in. We have a narrative that doesn't fit neatly into any one of our predefined scripts here, right? I mean, we've got part a globally activated terrorist, and we've got part kind of homegrown teenage loner script, and they're kind of coming together, and it's not really, there's nothing really kind of neat about it.
Yeah, this one's a tough one. I think on the program last week, before anything really had become clear, we'd asked the question, or I'd asked the question on the show, is this Taliban or Talibaba? And I'm going to ask our listeners and those viewers who are still with us to split the difference with me on this one, and here's why. Even though these kids were maybe seeking out Islamic radicalism, fundamentally, these were alienated white kids that were kind of looking for a purpose. And I don't think that the motives behind that are that different than what has motivated a lot of the right-wing terror bombings over the last 10 to 12 years, or the right-wing plots, certainly. Nor is it that different than the motives behind something like Newtown or the Aurora shootings last summer, or Virginia Tech. I mean, these are alienated kids that don't have a sense of purpose. Right. And and as their uncle described, I thought that was one of the most compelling things that came out of this. I mean, maybe not with great media training or eloquence behind it, but you heard the interview with their uncle, where he said, "Hey, these kids are just losers." I mean, it's basically it, right? Like, hey, they came to this country, which is a great country because there's all this opportunity, and they're just losers because they couldn't figure out how to take advantage of it.
Right.
And to me, I mean, you could full stop, end of story right there. These are a couple of losers who didn't have anything else to do and were able to, through the internet and whatever else, like sort of find some kind of an ideology to glom onto, not at the goading of that ideology, but at their own behest. And, we're able to perpetrate something like this.
It's really interesting. And it begs the question, which I'm not the first one to ask, is how is it different because they use bombs and not guns, right? I mean, if these guys walked into the Boston Marathon with a couple of, AR-15s and just shot up the place,
that had a much
how
higher
would the
body
situation
count.
be different? Yeah, probably. Yeah. But how would it have been played out differently? How would we think about it differently? How would we react to it differently? I mean, you've got like moron Lindsey Graham saying that, this guy doesn't even deserve a trial or what, like blowing up on his Twitter feed, talking about how we need to, just like put him in jail or some firing squad, like people all of a sudden, like I was talking about scripts earlier. I mean, I think there's a tendency among certain people to jump to the terrorist script and say, Liz Cheney was like, why are we even reading him his rights? And what, are we going to let him have a lawyer and all this kind of stuff? Why don't we just shoot the guy? Like all of this kind of this rhetoric appears because we start treating it as a terrorist issue, which we think about differently, which none of that really comes to mind when you have a mass shooter, right? In the same way.
Totally. And it's, this one feels to me like there is more of a societal need that the rest of society has to try to fit what happened last week in Boston into some kind of Uber narrative than there is an actual sort of analysis of what actually happened here. I didn't say this on the program last week, and hindsight's 2020, so call me out on that if you will. But this didn't feel like a Al-Qaeda type incident, and there's two reasons for that. One reason that I would have given for that is, Al-Qaeda likes to blow shit up that makes news in other countries. And that's important in other countries. And, you think of something like the Boston Marathon, and okay, if you're a runner, yeah, you know what the Boston Marathon is. But really, the Boston Marathon, the World Trade Center was an international symbol of American power. And that's why Al-Qaeda, that's why Osama particularly had a thing for it and wanted to take it down, right? Or you think about something like the Empire State Building, you think about something like even the Space Needle, God forbid, or something like that, the Golden Gate Bridge, right? These are worldwide symbols of American wealth and power, and that's what Al-Qaeda really wants to disrupt. The second thing is, the Al-Qaeda MO is self-immolation in these events, right? It's suicide bombing. That's part of what the script is you do this because you're guaranteed to go to heaven and have your 40 grapes or virgins, depending on how many vowels and which ones you put in the middle of the uris in the Islamic text, right?
Okay.
But that's what you get.
Yeah.
This didn't feel like an Al-Qaeda event, but our news media, our society decided to make it this thing. I don't know. I don't think it was the right reaction.
Yeah, no,
I'm not in Boston. I wasn't in D.C. during 9/11, but
that's probably true. I mean, so there's a couple things that you mentioned there. I mean, the first, yes, it's not an Al-Qaeda type event in the sense that, if you want to define Al-Qaeda and that kind of the global jihad and the kind of, if you want to call them, I don't know, I don't want to give them too much credit, but the kind of the big thinkers, the kind of the brain trust behind Al-Qaeda in Al-Qaeda's heyday had a very philosophical commitment, like you said, to hitting targets of American power, exposing their vulnerability, making a big show of how the U.S. was a paper tiger, a grand goal of a caliphate that stretched across, whatever, the Middle East. They had, they had very, very ambitious goals like that. What I think this, again, we don't know. I mean, these guys' motives yet. I mean, we know that the older brother spent some time, going back to his homeland and spent, was in Russia for a few months. So we know some things, but what we don't, I guess, there's no sense in which this is a part of a larger effort to, I don't know, to take over the world. It
doesn't appear to be.
It doesn't appear to have a geopolitical motive.
Right. This is a jihad of two.
Right. Which gets to the question of what is terrorism. Right. I mean,
well, it's clearly terrorism. I don't think there's any question about that.
But the definition of terrorism, you can, you scare people with a point of political violence and making a point. If these guys are just losers, what's the political point? And if there's no political point, is it still terrorism?
Good point. That is a good point.
That's what I'm trying to understand.
You're right. And I think that's a fair criticism, right? If there's no sort of objective in this, if there's no kind of thing that they're trying to accomplish through this, it's a couple of bored kids who read a few books or talked to a couple of the wrong people when they went to visit their family. I mean, it's I don't know. It's weird. And so the histrionics of like Lindsey Graham and some of these folks who were talking about, there shouldn't even be Mirandized, send them to Guantanamo. I mean, it's right. Come on, really? Right. And I look at the spectacle of a major American metropolitan area being locked down because two kids were out on a really brutal, violent, bloody joyride, but not dissimilar to what you could see in a movie theater right now if you went out and bought a $14 ticket. Really? I mean, really? Have we come to that?
You think Boston overreacted?
Oh, I think absolutely it overreacted. I don't think there's any question that everybody involved overreacted.
Interesting.
I think you have a bunch of people who, felt incredibly powerless, who saw, admittedly, a really horrific thing happen that was, it really ripped at the sort of fundamentals of that community. Nonetheless, I think they completely overreacted. I mean, there was nothing in this whatsoever that spoke to any kind of like overarching plot or any kind of particular sophistication, from the bomb designs to the way it was planned to the way it was executed. Nothing. Complete overreaction.
Interesting. Fair enough. I want to talk about broaden the issue a little bit because basically there's been some talk in D.C. this week that this might affect the coming immigration debate. You go back 100 years to the trials of Sacco and Vanzetti and the scourge of Italian immigration 100 years ago, and the thought that there's been some folks have been saying that, well, maybe we can't have immigration reform now because these guys were both migrated to this country, and what does that mean that we've got these two guys who've been radicalized? Can we actually afford more immigration? I mean, this is all silly, ridiculous, DC stuff. Like when there's a snowstorm in DC, they can't talk about climate change. It's kind of immature, but nonetheless, there is a sense this will have repercussions in terms of immigration. There was just to put it even more starkly, there's somebody was quoted in the New York Times not too long ago. An anonymous senator was quoted as saying that he had gone to the White House was asking him to vote on gun control, and he was just like, look, I can't, we've got, we passed, or I don't know if we passed, but we've got gay rights, immigration reform and gun control. Like, I can be with you on one of them or two of them, but I can't be with you on all three, was the quote, or something to that effect. This idea that two or three of these very fundamental, right-wing views are all coming up and being challenged at once. Are they all going to be adversely impacted by this? But also, can we take on all of these things at once, or is it just too much for the system to handle?
We talked on the show last week about the challenges of the system and sort of why it's problematic. I think any one of these issues independently is challenging right now, just because of the layout of the U.S. Congress and because of the way money flows into politics right now. So, it's not gonna help the debate. I'll throw another one out there. I mean, thankfully I haven't seen a whole lot of this, but there was a tweet around. I think it was the younger of the brother. Is the younger one Joker? The Joker? Zokar?
Is that what his name means?
Zokar. So, it doesn't mean Joker, but
okay.
You could.
Okay, fair enough.
You could, do a bad pronunciation of it as, Joker. I think they transliterated it as Jahar, but one of the comments about this guy was, the dude smokes so much weed, I have no idea how he'd ever plan something like this, right? And there was actually a comment made. I mean, is this actually going to fuel the anti-weed movement again? Is this a new version of, reefer madness?
Yeah.
But it's the same thing, right? It's not like, the question to be asked is not, are all, does having more immigrants like make us more at risk of this? It's, why does one immigrant choose to do this? Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I mean, I think it's a tough legislative space already. I mean, does it add fuel to the fire? Of course it does. I mean, how can it not? I mean, you have been talking about the challenges of perception among voters and things mm-hmm. like this, and we've talked about that a lot on this show. I don't see how this helps, right?
So
it's like you said, it's like, it snows in DC and we can't have a conversation about climate change. All right, so one immigrant, is a disaffected youth that talks to the wrong people, buys the wrong book.
Meanwhile, this larger chunk of immigrants are struggling to assimilate and working really hard to assimilate. There was a really interesting piece in the New York Times this week about Hispanic assimilation. A lot of there's been a lot of talk about the challenges of bringing in a lot of new immigrants into the country and whether or not they will assimilate and adopt our culture and language and customs and all that kind of stuff. But it's actually an interesting study that was done about first and second generation immigrants. So they basically looked at Latino immigrants, specifically the first generation to the second generation, and the delta in terms of things like intermarriage and college education and income level and all this kind of stuff. And what you see that between the first and second generation, there's this huge jump, this huge leap up. So the first generation comes in poor and uneducated, and the second generation starts intermarrying and starts, getting good education and all of these kinds of things. And basically they assimilate really rapidly, in some cases even more rapidly than other immigrants before them. The Leonhardt who wrote the article, or he quotes one of the scientists, is saying basically Hispanics are more or less on a par with the Italians 100 years ago, to bring it back to bring it back to that you basically had an uneducated, relatively poor Catholic mass of immigrants kind of flood the country who didn't speak the language, and within a generation or two had kind of become totally adopted into the the U.S. Cultural and political system and had contributed to it. So I think that's the thing that we have to keep in mind, is in the long term, in the broad picture, immigrants do assimilate, and the more of them we have, the more they assimilate. Because they're kind of forced to, because they have to kind of deal with each other. And so, U.S. and American customs become the default kind of middle ground, right? Yes. So there's a way in which the kind of polyglot kind of sorts itself out. And so I think that's the thing to keep in mind with this immigration debate. And unfortunately, we've got in immigration, the proposals on the table right now is basically you've got to go through all these hoops. You've got to wait 10 years, go back to your country, and then maybe you have a chance to apply for a guest worker permit. And then maybe after that, 25 years later, you might be able to become it's ridiculous. It's very ridiculous. Not a great plan. Torture and hoops we're going through right now in this bill.
And it also focuses on the bottom end of the labor market. It doesn't get to the top end.
And it doesn't and it's based on whether or not we've decided how secure the border is, based on some report card of how many people are getting through. I mean, there's all sorts of it's just become this, it's an insult to Rube Goldberg.
To have something like this where there's as much bureaucracy that needs to be created to support this program, proposed by those who are ostensibly anti-government conservatives, it's pretty ridiculous. I mean, I think if you were truly a small government conservative that really believed nonetheless that we needed comprehensive immigration reform, what you would probably do is come up with some kind of a plan that would basically say, hey, if you can pay us a certain amount of money, you're a citizen, period. End of story, full stop. That's the simplest way to do it.
Yeah, it's true. That's true. You just basically buy it.
Right.
So speaking of good government reform, before we go out, I want to go on a quick hit here. I think there's so many opportunities. One of the things we keep trying to come back to on the show is that there's so many opportunities for principled small government conservatives to find ways to reform the existing system, as long as they buy into the system, right? I really think that we do need a let's say libertarian critique of things like climate policy and immigration policy and transportation policy. I think I would like to see a right of center market-based, people come to the table and say like, look, you've got, you're proposing this cap and trade system. It's an unworkable mess. The straightforward, economically efficient, small government way to deal with climate change is a carbon tax, and we will support that, and instead of saying we don't believe in global warming and blah, 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 right, and just obstructing it. Right. So there's so many complicated issues on the table that it would be very important to have a right of center perspective that was committed in good faith to solving those issues. one interesting issue and situation in which this comes up is Oregon Iron Works, and specifically their United Streetcar subsidiary. So for those folks who don't know, this is a bit of a local thing, but I think it has national implications. It definitely has national implications at this point. There's a company in Oregon called United Streetcar that is a subsidiary of Oregon Iron Works. And what they do is they build streetcars, obviously, and they got into the streetcar business a few years ago after Portland bought some Czech design streetcars for its streetcar line, and decided that it would like very much to have a homegrown streetcar manufacturing industry in the Portland area, and it would bring all of these jobs, and we would make streetcars. Portland would make streetcars for all of these cities in America. Well, the Oregonian, I guess it's OregonLive.com. They've got an amazing long story that we'll post a link to that I highly recommend you read about the trouble that United Streetcars had getting off the ground and actually producing streetcars. They're over budget. They can't build the propulsion systems. They don't have any expertise in building streetcars. They're basically, what happens is, for those folks who don't know, we have a Buy American provision when it comes to acquiring things like transit systems, where basically the federal government requires that a certain percentage of the actual vehicle is assembled or made or built or created in America, right? And there's some percentages and there's kind of ways to fudge it, but basically what it means is that the U.S. is barred from accessing the most modern streetcar designs, which are or subway designs, which are usually built in Europe and Japan, and we can't buy them because the federal government has decided that they want to have us to tie one hand behind our backs. With the potentially laudable purpose of creating American jobs. The problem is that, we have this catch-22 where we basically have to spend twice as much as normal, so we buy half as many streetcars, so we're never actually able to build a domestic streetcar industry because we can't actually build up the expertise, and we're not allowed to buy European models. So basically what you have is what happened with United Streetcar is they licensed the design from a Czech manufacturer, but then they were going to build it, and they got some Wisconsin company to build the propulsion system. None of this stuff ended up working. It's way behind budget. The DC and Tucson, Arizona have both gotten into contracts with Oregon Iron Works, with United Streetcar, to actually buy streetcars from them, and they can't get DC is not going to get their streetcars because basically Portland, Oregon Iron Works can't build them fast enough. So I think what I would love to see, this is an issue where I would just love to see somebody with a right of center perspective come in and say, hey, you know what? Let's just buy the cheapest, most effective streetcars we can buy on the global market. Yeah. And let's get as many streetcars as we can. And if we have an issue with, American manufacturing, let's focus on American manufacturing, but let's not, try to kill two birds with one stone here, because you just end up with like half a dead bird. Yeah. And that's kind of what we've got here. The number of jobs is not huge. They promised hundreds of jobs. They've maybe got dozens out of this. It's not the kind of thing that's going to get you the massive amounts of jobs, and it's just the government interfering in the market when we should just be buying cheap streetcars. Yeah, absolutely. And that's absolutely true. I'll do just a quick hit on the way out here. So last week on the program, we had made the bold assertion, as sometimes we do on these shows, and in this case, it was asserting that most terrorist acts over the last 12 years have been committed by right-wing extremists. So the most maybe is something that I can't demonstrate right now, but we did post a link on our Facebook page to all of the right-wing plots that have been prosecuted in the United States since the Oklahoma City bombings in the mid-90s. And one thing I just wanted to point out is when I say right-wing terror, there's a perspective that I think that you could say that even Islamic terror, in a certain sense, is right-wing terror, in the sense that it intends to impose its own vision of an idealized society on everybody else. It's conservative and reactionary. Right, it's conservative and reactionary. That's kind of a fundamental sort of marker of conservatism. But even if you don't make that argument, it is also true that most of the terror plots in the United States that have been prosecuted since 9/11 have in fact been planned by right-wing groups. And that's as opposed to left-wing groups like Sacco and Vanzetti, which you mentioned earlier in the program, which is more common in the earlier part of the 20th century. That's going to be our program for today. Until next time, we thank you once again for listening and hopefully viewing. If you'd like to reach us, you can do so. We are brunoandtheprof@gmail.com. We also spend a lot of time on our Facebook page, facebook.com/BrunoAndTheProfessor. Thanks once again. We'll talk to you next week.